Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel for this next episode of Ships of War, the series in which I look at historic warships, the famous, the not so famous, and sometimes the downright notorious, and not only try to briefly situate them in their historical context, but also look at how they have been represented in a particular game system, and marrying that up with the histories of the actual ships, try to gauge whether they have been treated fairly in said game system, or whether the designer might have been a bit off kilter for some reason. And today's pairing, following closely from the series I did on Stephen Cunliffe's The Fires of Midway, I'm going to pick on two of the most interesting and famous carriers in the Imperial Japanese Navy and the US Navy. And of course, we have on the left here the famous HIJMS Akagi, which was the flagship of the first mobile force, fought at Pearl Harbor and, of course, came to grief at the Battle of Midway in June 1942. And over here, one of her antagonists from the US Navy, the equally famous USS Lexington, one of the two largest carriers in the world throughout the 1930s and for pretty much the first half of the 1940s, well, up to this one's demise at any rate. And she, of course, was briefly involved in the Pacific until her untimely death at the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942. So, before I get going on the comparing the way that the ships have been treated in this game, just a very interesting word about the background to these two very, very fascinating ships. Because in a way, they both had really broadly parallel lives in their respective services. And I'm going to start with the interesting one, which is that they were never intended to be to be aircraft carriers at when they were first planned, between sort of in the very end of World War One and the early 1920s. Both the US Navy and the Imperial Japanese Navy were very, very interested in the acquisition of large and powerful battle cruisers. And despite the problems that had been illustrated with the type during the First World War, it was believed that it still had great potential. The British had shared the specifications of HMS Hood with their US counterparts. And of course, at the time, to a lesser degree, the Japanese had become aware of the Hoods as well, but they were basing their thoughts on their British-built Congo class. Well, I'll say their British-designed Congo class more accurately. So come the end of the first decade of the 20th century, the US Navy was aware of this development. And knowing what they did about Hood, they wanted to go one better and build the incredibly fast and powerful Lexington class of 6 ships. The Japanese wanted two equivalent and very powerful, very fast battle cruisers, which would have borne the names Akagi and Amagi. Now, what killed the idea was the Washington Naval Treaty and the restrictions that both the US and Japan agreed to under the terms of that treaty in 1921. Now, through various different processes, it was decided in the US very sensibly that the two hulls of the first 2 Lexingtons, which were nearing completion but which could not be completed as battle cruisers, had great potential to be turned into carriers instead. The US Navy had become very keen on aviation in the First World War, and through the conversion of the collier Jupiter into a proto-aircraft carrier, had learned a great deal about naval aviation, basically wanted to learn more, and the massive hulls of the Lexingtons gave them pretty much what they wanted. And it was the same with Japan. Akagi herself, you can't see it so well in this photo, it's a bit grainy, but she was a mostly complete battlecruiser hull, and it wasn't that much of an effort. In fact, it was almost, in some respects, a little bit less to just rebuild the top of the vessel as an aircraft carrier. And so, by fortunate chance, almost these two navies had a chance to get a good start in the fleet aircraft carrier race which really commenced in the 1920s. Very interestingly, because a lot of work went into the conversion, it was structurally they were in some ways simpler to complete than heavily armored surface warships, but at the same time they were both going into relatively uncharted territory. And so work went on for quite a long time. And both ships curiously entered service in 1927, within a couple of months of each other. And I'm just going to bring in this photo of Lexington, showing her as fairly new. And I like this because, turbulence, I'm sorry. It's a good photo. It shows most of the main features of the ship. Now, there are various design studies for the original Lexington as battlecruiser, and they show a lot of funnels, even the more conservative variants. And you can get a sense of that because these were trunked into this massive effort here, which dwarfs the rest of the island superstructure. And the other clue that this is the 1920s is there was a lot of uncertainty about whether aircraft carriers might not find themselves in situations where they had to fight surface ships, which is why Lexington retained a very generous battery of 8-inch guns for surface combat. There is, in fact, a rather nice photo. It's not as nice as the equivalent one for her sister Saratoga, which shows the 5-inch guns as well. But there are Lexington's very, very impressive, essentially cruiser gun turrets, firing off practice shots during the I think it's either the late 1920s or sometime in the 1930s, this picture, but there you go. Impressive though they looked, these gun houses were not armored. It was just straight, steel construction, but no armor to speak of. So they look impressive and they pack a punch, but they wouldn't really be able to take it. Excuse me. Now, the Japanese took a very, very different approach when they modified the Akagi. Now, you see Lexington, remarkably for the period, shows the very modern feature of a full-length flight deck. Now, this is at the time when the British had completed and were modifying multi-story aircraft carriers in the form of Courageous, Glorious, and Furious. But the US had gone for this flush deck approach. They'd seen British plans for carriers like Eagle, and they'd also seen Hermes, and they very quickly came to the conclusion that this was best, and they were absolutely right. The Japanese approach was very different and initially not as successful as the US one. So here is this wonderfully dramatic photo of Akagi running her trials. So she's very nearly complete, but a lot of things have not been installed. The first thing to note is no island. Initially, there was no island on these ships. They followed very early British practice in not having one, until it was proved to be a bit more of a necessary feature than they thought. Now, unlike the United States, who'd gone for the enormous, great trunked funnel, the Japanese had decided they wanted to trunk the air intakes, and this was for a smaller number of funnels, mind, out the starboard side of the ship. So that's what you see here. This is basically an enormous exhaust, which in theory is meant to channel the smoke away from the flight deck. Not entirely successful as a way of doing things, because all that hot gas, if the wind was on the wrong quarter, would generate immense problems and air turbulence for aircraft trying to come in. But I did mention the Japanese following the early British approach of multi-story hangar decks. So this first iteration of Akagi, she has 3 flight decks, effectively, 1 2/3 length for landing, and then these 2 internal ones can support simultaneous takeoffs from within the hangar. Very ingenious idea, and you could just about make it work with First World War era aircraft. Unfortunately, such was the pace of aircraft development that this design aged very badly indeed and was not entirely successful as first trialed. Whereas this was effectively future-proofed. So, there was absolutely nothing wrong with this. The only downside for the Lexington was that as aircraft like these, I think it's T1 torpedo bombers here, or actually, no, it might be an earlier model, as these were replaced by heavier, more powerful aircraft, she couldn't pack so many into her air complement. So she had an enormous flight deck, but it was still not quite what was needed. But you wouldn't alter the structure of the ship. What would happen is you'd simply reduce the size of your air wing, or try out new handling techniques and design planes with better folding wings to see if you can get round the problem. So between 1927 and the Second World War, Lexington underwent very, very few changes. In fact, I have a photo of her here just before the Second World War. In fact, you can see the Brewster Buffalo fighters on the forward end of her flight deck. And as you can see, very, very little has actually changed. So the ship's hardly been modified. In fact, her original armament defensively is still pretty much what it was. And despite the need to reduce the air complement slightly to account for more powerful aircraft, you can still see a great many planes parked on her deck. So still a very respectable fleet carrier. She had proved, along with her sister Saratoga, a very worthwhile investment for the US Navy. By contrast, Akagi cost the Empire of Japan a vast amount of money, particularly during her final refit, which lasted between 1935 and 1938. Now, this produced the really successful iteration of the ship. So I'm afraid this photo is a bit dark, but essentially what has happened is that the two lower flight decks have been completely suppressed and basically been worked into an extended hangar bay, which extends to about that far beneath the flight deck. The flight deck itself has been built up massively, so you now get a very respectable length, eminently suited for modern combat operations as they stood at the end of the 1930s. And despite the comprehensive nature of this rebuild, the Japanese were able to maintain the ship's speed. Now, going back to the game, it's a bit of an interesting one to compare these two because the Fires of Midway generalizes a great deal about certain carriers' attributes. And one of the major ones is air wing is treated through the use of air cards. And the easy way of reflecting changing air groups over time is simply to assign different aircraft cards to a different carrier. So the game does take care of this quite nicely. And really, for Akagi and Lexington, it's not really a problem because both of them only feature in one battle in the context of the game. Midway for Akagi and Coral Sea for Lexington. But if it's of interest, despite the slight advantage the Lexington had in dimensions over the Akagi, so just to put that into context, the Lexington was 808 feet long overall, give or take. Akagi was somewhere in the region of 860 feet and a smidge. And the Lexington was very slightly wider at 105-foot maximum beam. The Akagi was 95 feet. So there's not actually that much to choose between these two ships in terms of size, and most crucially in terms of hangar size and flight deck. Of course, there is the element of Japanese hangars being a tiny bit more cluttered than US ones. But equally, Lexington, massive though she was, her hangar was built within the hull of a battlecruiser. So that was going to impose restrictions. The length to beam ratio was actually not that helpful. So by the Second World War, they've got very different air wings. Lexington starts out with more in the 1920s. But by the very late 1930s, her air wings have shrunk considerably. So you can cram 80 aircraft onto Lexington in 1939, but that's your absolute maximum. And operationally, you can't put that number into the air in a carrier strike. Some of them have to be stowed, dismantled in your hangar, or stored very awkwardly. So by 1939, her operational capability was actually 63. That comprised 18 fighters, 40 bombers divided between dive and torpedo bombers, and 5 utility aircraft. Now, Akagi could cram in 90 aircraft in total, but like Lexington, that is including planes that had to be jammed into awkward parts of the hangar. Some of them had to be stowed with their wings and fuselages separately. So the 90 is a bit of a misleading figure. The reality was at Midway, she probably had about 70, 72-ish serviceable aircraft that could be deployed quickly and didn't require any sort of assembly before they took to the air. Even so, it does mean the Japanese did have a slight edge, or at least I'll say the Akagi had a slight edge over the Lexington in aircraft totals, but not by much. Give them 10 aircraft, which can be crucial in some circumstances, maybe not in others. But moving on to what we can see, and just to remind you all what the topography of these cards are, obviously you've got name, victory points. That's damage threshold. That is what the ships roll to check when they suffer critical hits to their hulls. So Akagi is damaged a bit more easily if a 4 or more is rolled, as opposed to Lexington with a 5 or more. These two dice here are an amalgam of their maneuvering and anti-aircraft capability, essentially their capability for throwing off bomber attacks. So the ships are credited with being equally maneuverable. That is the anti-aircraft strength. Now, the Japanese are given a 1 bullet icon, so they roll 1 dice damage if they manage to get the better of US aircraft. The Lexington rolls 2. And then down here you have the steps to record hull damage. So as they're rather dramatically put, full strength, cracked, ruptured. And if you go beyond ruptured, you turn that over. So let's start with this, and let's link it to this, because armor, protection, and hull strength are an integral part of the same thing. In terms of subdivision and flotation, Lexington and Akagi were very, very similar. They had the same kind of design for resisting damage from shells and torpedoes, to a very, very limited degree from bombs, but this was almost non-existent because any of the battlecruiser type protection that had been worked into their designs was limited by the need to refashion their interiors when they became aircraft carriers. But leaving that aside, I'd say the compartmentalization in Lexington and her pumping systems were somewhat better than Akagi's, at least as far as is known. But it wasn't by very much. The two were much of a muchness. So I think, given that the level of flotation here, it makes sense that it's equal. Although, to be fair, the game gives that level to every carrier, including Hiryu and Soryu on the Japanese side. So treat that one with a bit of caution. Now, I think the ease of damage, this roll that moves the ship from its healthy to its crippled side, that's not just a reflection of structure, although that's a very important point. The Lexington's hangar was much more strongly built than Akagi's, which was a very flimsy structure by comparison, but also the damage capabilities of the two sides. And one of the things the US started the war quite good at was damage control, and they maintained that lead over the Japanese, generally speaking. Maneuverability, again, I would give them credit for having the same capabilities, but again with the proviso that this game assigns 2 dice to every healthy carrier, except for the Japanese light carriers, because I think they're penalized for their relative lack of defensive armament. I do question, however, and the rating here where the Lexington's been given a higher rating. And before I do that, I'll just confirm, if you're wondering about the speed of the two ships, which lends itself to maneuverability, By 1942, both ships, despite a bit of age and deterioration, could handle 30 knots without breaking a sweat. They could push beyond that, Akagi to about 31 and a half, Lexington to 33, but they could very easily crank up to 30 if given enough time, and they could hold that for an impressive period. And both of them turned quite well for ships of their length, so not so much to choose between them. The damage of their weapons, the reason I question that is because by 1942, both ships had had their 8-inch guns removed. In fact, at the time of their sinking, Akagi only had 6, which were sighted in casemates low down in the hull, no value as anti-aircraft weapons whatsoever. And what she was left with was these rather poorly sighted 4.7-inch guns. Nice photo of them just there, which were badly sighted because they were a significant way below the level of the flight deck, so you didn't have any kind of decent cross-deck fire, which is so essential in an anti-aircraft gun. And half of the 12 were on 6 guns per side in twin mountings, which was quite a clumsy arrangement. The Lexington had the same number of barrels, but they were dispersed much more sensibly in groups of 3 on each quarter, so 3, 3, and then repeated on the other side. The excellent US 5-inch dual-purpose gun, a very nimble mount by the standards of the day, but still not brilliant because in early 1942, anti-aircraft gun direction was not what it should have been, both in the US Navy and in the Imperial Japanese Navy. In addition to this, the Japanese had a number of light machine guns on the Akagi studded about the hull, but these were their 25mm anti-aircraft gun, and they really were not up to much. Similarly, the Lexington, when she was lost, had a whopping 48 50 caliber machine guns, but these were the older pattern, the old 0.5 that tended to jam. And they were not a very reliable mounting. So very popular with their users, and they made a lot of noise and put up an impressive barrage. But Lexington's anti-aircraft fire in May 1942 was nowhere near as capable or destructive as US anti-aircraft fire later on in the war. So I think the design's been very slightly generous in giving Lexington that additional firepower. But it's a very broad decision by the designer to compensate the US for other things and to reflect the fact that over the whole of 1942, US anti-aircraft fire was generally a bit better than what was put up by Japanese carriers. So I feel it overpowers the USAA capabilities a little bit in the context of May 1942, but then for a game that's intended more to be a fun and engaging representation of carrier warfare, I understand why that decision was made, and it does make sense because it does contribute to the game balance. And and taking the slightly weaker Japanese hull ratings and their weaker AA and balancing it against the much greater capabilities of their aircraft, I think it does give you a game which is quite nicely balanced. So not sure I would give them the same ratings if you were being very strictly accurate about it, but equally, this is not that sort of simulation, and I get why the decisions were made. So, so there we go. A very quick run through the capabilities of these two very interesting ships as represented in the Fires of Midway. I do hope you found this interesting. And as always, I have the greatest fun looking at ships in the context of historical war games. And I really appreciate those of you who follow this series. A huge hello to my long-suffering veterans who continue to follow the channel and this series in particular. And a very warm welcome to anyone who might be visiting for the first time. If this is the first of my videos, hello. please feel free to join our merry band. You're more than welcome. If it's the Fires of Midway that brought you here, please have a look at the other videos I've done covering that game. And if it's wargaming in general, hello, you're in among a very large crowd of fans here, and it's great to see you. But whoever you are and wherever you're watching from, as always, my deepest thanks and much appreciation. And I really look forward to seeing you guys in the next video. Take care. Bye.